New lockdown measures are being introduced in China as more virus outbreaks continue. Multiple earthquakes hit the upper reaches of the Yangtze River as a third wave of floods forms. And the apparel industry is being called out for using slave labor in China. Welcome back, everyone. First off, some news updates on the virus. The city of Yining was reportedly shut down in the middle of the night. This is the second city in Xinjiang province that has been shut down, with the other city being Urumqi. Now, while Urumqi city has been placed on lockdown, the number of virus cases that are confirmed is continuing to rise. Now, according to a report from the Xinjiang Uyghur Health Commission, since July 26, there have been 41 newly confirmed CCP virus cases in the Xinjiang Uyghur area, including Xinjiang Production and Construction Corp., all of which were in Urumqi. 38 out of the 41 new cases were asymptomatic, and now there are 8,795 people under observation. And of course, keep in mind that with the CCP, it has repeatedly played down its numbers, and so the confirmed numbers are not really accurate typically. Now, in addition to Urumqi, locals are reporting that in Yining City in Xinjiang, they were also notified to shut down in the middle of the night. There have not been official announcements on the shutdown, but this is raising concerns that the CCP virus is spreading further. Now, according to reports from local media, Urumqi medical institutions are performing nucleic acid tests around the clock. One of these media, YLXW, reported they're doing these tests in laboratories, quote, as if it's a competition. Now, in addition to this, another outbreak of the CCP virus has started in Dalian and has now spread to 7 cities in 4 provinces. Cases of the CCP virus spiked in Dalian after a man working at a Chinese seafood processor, its Kaiyang World Seafood, tested positive. Now, soon after that, authorities suspended 99 passenger bus lines in the city. Local officials announced the newly confirmed cases included bus drivers, restaurant staff, and construction workers. Videos from the ground show long lines at inspection points in Dalian, with large crowds gathering in some areas. Now, as of midnight of July 25th, the epidemic in Dalian had spread to 7 cities in 4 provinces again. Now, official notices were issued in many places, including in Songyuan City and Jilin Province, Jilin City, Harbin City, and Heiliangjiang Province, and others, urging people to not go to Dalian unless necessary. CCP officials are also prohibited now from going to Dalian. Meanwhile, the disasters in China are continuing. The Yangtze River is currently experiencing its second wave flood, which is worse than the first. Waters from the second wave have just passed the Three Gorges Dam. So in other words, this is just kind of starting right now, and they're still moving downstream. And now an official announcement is saying that the third wave of the floods has formed upstream on the Yangtze River. Now, the Three Gorges Dam reservoir has already recorded an inflow of 164,000 cubic feet per second and is expected to peak at 196,000 cubic feet per second by Tuesday, according to reports from China's Ministry of Water Resources. Meanwhile, in addition to the torrential rains and floods, multiple earthquakes hit the upper reaches of the Yangtze River. On July 27th, a 3.4 magnitude earthquake hit in Yining City in Sichuan Province, which marks the 6th earthquake in the area recently. There were also multiple landslides and mudslides in Sichuan. On July 25th, Mao County of Aba Prefecture in Sichuan suffered heavy rainfall. Flash floods and mudslides broke out in Fengyi Town in Sichuan, breaking roads, halting traffic, and also stopping some of the power supplies. Official reports said that about 14 farmhouses and gas stations were damaged. Now, on July 26th, the day after this, another landslide took place in Yining City of Sichuan, and a local factory was destroyed. Official reports said 2 people were killed in that. And landslides in Wulong district of Chongqing City, also in Sichuan, formed a barrier lake. Officials warned the temporary embankment of this lake could collapse at any moment. And in addition to floods on the Yangtze River, other bodies of water in China are seeing similar floods. Flood alert levels were raised along the Huai River, going from Wangjiaba to Shuyi. 10 reservoirs on the Huai River have seen water levels exceeding warning levels by as much as 22 feet, according to the Huaihe River Commission of China's Ministry of Water Resources. And now for the broader stories for today. First off, some additional news on the CCP virus. A researcher at the Washington University School of Medicine found that the CCP may have been aware of human-to-human transmission in this virus as early as December 2019. And this is before the world was alerted by the National Health Commission of human-to-human transmission on January 23, 2020. And also the World Health Organization is under pressure for repeating the CCP's information verbatim during the outbreak, which also helped the CCP mislead the world. And Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is now allegedly saying that the CCP had bought off Tedros, the head of the WHO. Bloomberg reported that Pompeo made the statement during a private meeting in London. Now, it cited anonymous sources who were allegedly present at the meeting. It claims Pompeo said there is, quote, firm intelligence, showing the CCP helped Tedros obtain his position at the WHO. Now, as a bit of background on this, people paid the price of the world not being told about human-to-human transmission. The United States put in travel bans from China. Many other countries did not. And when the US put travel bans on China because he was concerned again about the possibility of human-to-human transmission, Trump was criticized for doing so. The WHO itself was actually calling out Trump for some of the measures he was taking. But given the fact that this virus does have human-to-human transmission, the world just was not yet alerted at that time. These different measures taken early very likely saved many lives. And also, the United States cut its funding to the WHO and pulled out of the WHO after determining through an investigation that the WHO could not demonstrate its independence from the Chinese Communist Party. Also, now there are calls for investigations into the origin of this virus. Many countries in the world, the United States, Australia, New Zealand, many others, are asking for an investigation into where this virus came from. Now, the Chinese Communist Party had said it would not allow any third party into China, would not allow anybody into China to investigate this. Then it walked that statement back a little bit and said it would allow the WHO to investigate. Why would it say the WHO could investigate but nobody else would be allowed to? And now news is coming out that the WHO is doing an investigation into the origin of the virus, but according to many reports, they are not going to be going to this Wuhan laboratory that has become the focus as a possible lab leak origin of this virus. And so again, what do we have here? We have evidence that the CCP lied to the world or withheld information from the world that could have saved many lives. We also now have evidence that there is additional, concern that Tedros may have been acting at the behest of the CCP and also misled the world about the seriousness and risks of the virus. Companies are being warned about having slave labor in their supply chains, and close to 80 major brands, including Nike, Adidas, Lenovo, Samsung, and many others, are being called out for using slave labor from Xinjiang, China, in their supply chains. Now, 9to5Mac reported that a coalition of campaigners is now saying that Apple must take action on the possibility that slave labor from Muslim Uyghurs is being used in its supply chain. Now, Apple claimed, according to BBC, quote, "We have found no evidence of any forced labor on Apple production lines and we plan to continue monitoring." But BBC noted reports from the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, US Congress, and other sources, and noted they, quote, have found that thousands of Uyghurs have been transferred to work in factories across China under conditions the ASPI, this Australian group report says, quote, strongly suggests forced labor. It linked these factories to more than 80 high-profile brands, including Nike, Apple, and Gap. Now, the apparel industry is coming into broader focus as well. A report from Sourcing Journal, one of these industry publications, said that nearly the entire apparel industry is complicit in the CCP's human rights abuses of Uyghurs. And as the CCP's use of slave labor comes into broader focus, Eco-Textile, another industry publication, reports that brands have begun distancing themselves from the Xinjiang cotton industry. And the Uyghur Human Rights Project is reporting that over 180 organizations are demanding that apparel brands end their involvement in the CCP's use of Uyghurs for slave labor. Meanwhile, the CCP is facing increasing pressure for its human rights abuses, including of Muslim Uyghurs, Tibetan Buddhists, Falun Gong practitioners, and house Christians. And even Western companies, including many in the United States, are being called out for various degrees of involvement in these abuses. With Christians, meanwhile, International Christian Concern, a human rights group, is reporting that the CCP has been continuing its persecution of Christians and its destruction of churches. And this is no longer even limited to underground churches, the ones not approved by the CCP. The report says this, quote, "In the CCP's worldview, If Christians love God more than the Communist Party, then the persecution is the prescription. As Christians in China struggle to resume a sense of normality in their lives, the CCP is making life needlessly difficult for them. And with Tibetans, meanwhile, World Politics Review is reporting that while the world's been watching the CCP's actions in Hong Kong and against Uyghurs, quote, the regime successfully avoided international attention and opprobrium or harsh criticism as it carried out what could prove to be its most devastating push elsewhere in Tibet. Now, the regime has continued its suppression of Tibetans and its destruction of the Tibetan culture. And in addition to this, with the Chinese Communist Party's persecution of Falun Gong, also known as Falun Dafa, officials in the Trump administration are now expressing concern over the CCP's killing of Falun Gong practitioners on demand for their organs. Canadian senators and human rights advocates are calling for sanctions against CCP officials involved in forced organ harvesting and other atrocities as well. And so what are we seeing here? The Chinese Communist Party's human rights abuses are being exposed and condemned across the board. And these are all the 5 no-go topics of the CCP. What are the 5 no-go topics? Xinjiang, Tibet, Falun Gong, Hong Kong, and Taiwan. Every single one of these is being hit on right now. All of these pressure points of the CCP are being touched on. And what does that mean? It means the United States and the rest of the world are no longer worried about angering the CCP. They are now willing to call out its abuses of its own people for the sake of upholding international values. They're no longer afraid to call out the Chinese Communist Party for using slave labor, which again, many companies that have been virtue signaling in the US are involved with. Companies talking about slavery, the history of slavery, are using slave labor as we speak. And the Chinese Communist Party is being called out for this now. US officials and international officials are now calling out the CCP for doing so. The Chinese Communist Party is using living people as sources for organ transplants, killing them on demand for profit. And the Chinese Communist Party is now being called out for doing so. It is destroying ethnic minorities. It is destroying their culture. It is putting them in prison and using them as slaves. It is being called out across the board now for doing this. And so what does this mean as well? Chinese officials are also now facing sanctions. This means that the responsibility for these human rights abuses is not just falling on the shoulders of the Chinese Communist Party. Individuals are now being held accountable. If this all comes out, we could see something very similar to the Nazi war tribunals. And in addition to this, Chinese Communist Party officials are now being held individually responsible for their involvement in these abuses through international sanctions. Now, so far, this has only been done against CCP officials involved in the abuses in Hong Kong and the abuses against Muslim Uyghurs. But we could see an expansion of this. It could soon involve other Chinese Communist Party officials. And this is sending a message to them. If they have been involved in human rights abuses, if they've been involved in these atrocities, they can be held responsible to it. If the full scope of the CCP's abuses come out, we could see something very similar to the Nuremberg trials, only with Chinese Communist Party officials and maybe even some Western business leaders being held accountable for these abuses. Now on that note too, foreign companies that have been complicit in the CCP's abuses are now being exposed as well. And in somewhat related news to this, the U.S. Senate passed the 2021 National Defense Authorization Act with an 86-14 vote, with provisions to support Taiwan. Now, the NDAA ensures the 6 assurances provided to Taiwan under former U.S. President Ronald Reagan back in 1982. And this includes continuing arms sales to Taiwan and to not play the mediating role between Taiwan and mainland China. And so what does this mean again? Again, the CCP has these no-go topics. Taiwan is among them. And the United States is also no longer backing down on supporting Taiwan when it comes to standing up against the CCP and defending Taiwan from forceful takeover from the CCP, which the CCP has been threatening. And also, Taiwan has entered the world stage. During this virus outbreak, it contrasted very strongly with the CCP because while the CCP was doing things like mask diplomacy, Taiwan was providing masks, functioning masks, and different medical equipment to different countries. Taiwan showed itself on the world stage as an alternative when it comes to Chinese leadership to the CCP. Now, in other news, the Chinese-made app TikTok is going to be banned on US government devices under a new Senate bill. Now, it hasn't passed, notably, But it very likely could, and of course this is something the Trump administration has been discussing, a possible ban on TikTok, very similar to what we just saw done in India. And what would this mean? It would mean one of the largest social media websites would be banned in the United States, and at the very least under this bill, blocked from US government employees. And what does this mean again? It means that the Chinese Communist Party is being called out on its tech censorship and also its tech monitoring. And this is something that is not limited to TikTok. Almost all Chinese companies, if you're operating in China, you are required to follow Chinese law. Part of following Chinese law means making all your data viewable by the Chinese Communist Party. They have no choice. If they're going to work in China, they have to cooperate with Chinese authorities. Now, ByteDance, the company in charge of TikTok, said it does not do so. It does not share data with the CCP. But there's been evidence suggesting otherwise, including censorship actions and including, say, different findings that show TikTok is in fact monitoring and taking data from users. Data it should not be taking, for example, key logging. And also, as we mentioned before, the head of ByteDance, the CEO of ByteDance, came out publicly previously and apologized to the CCP for not closely following its different guidelines. And the CEO promised that going forward he would not only follow those guidelines, but also provide training to his staff on doing so. This was right ahead of when TikTok hit the world stage. And what does that mean? It means that the things that TikTok is now being accused of doing, the concerns around TikTok, the head of the company that runs it promised that he would be taking actions that fit that exact same description. And in other news, when it comes to Chinese military activities, the state-run Global Times tweeted this, quote, "China will hold large-scale live fire drills in the waters near the Lejiao Peninsula, doorstep to the South China Sea from July 25th to August 2nd, the PLA announced, People's Liberation Army. Now, when it comes to this as well, South China Morning Post is reporting that the Chinese Air Force is sending a warning to the U.S. Navy with live fire drills. And also, China is expanding its amphibious forces in a challenge to the U.S., according to Reuters. And so what are we seeing here? The Chinese Communist Party is holding these military exercises in the South China Sea using live fire drills. And it's saying that ships cannot be going through that area during this time. Now, this takes place also as the United States, Australia, and other countries are hosting their own military exercises, and the CCP, in its own words here, is trying to send a message, a threat, to the U.S. military based on this. And the position of these exercises in the South China Sea is also significant because the CCP claims control over most of the South China Sea, and its 9-dash line even includes Taiwan, for example. Now, the CCP has been found in international courts to not have historical ownership over the South China Sea. The CCP shot back and said, well, according to Chinese law, we do. And if you want to debate us on that, come to Chinese courts and we'll see who wins. And so what's happening again? The Chinese Communist Party is showing aggression on every front, whether it's border disputes with India, whether it's its claims over Taiwan, whether it's the end of Hong Kong's autonomy, whether it's abuses of the various persecuted groups in China, and whether it comes to, say, criticism of the CCP internationally with its wolf warrior diplomacy. The CCP has an increased hostility on every front, and this new military drill is showing a new level to that. Now, some updates on these consulate closures. The United States has taken over the Chinese consulate in Houston, and officials are now saying the closure of this facility was not done randomly. Now, in addition to this, a senior official with the Department of Justice is saying there were over 50 examples from over the last 10 years of the Houston Chinese consulate supporting talent plan members, presumably the 1,000 Talents program, and recruitments in the area targeting various research centers. Now, this is according to a statement from the State Department itself. And also a former CCP diplomat, Chen Yongling, who had defected in Australia, is now saying the Houston Chinese consulate likely burned secret reports on its spy operations. And now, of course, there's a bit of context on that. Soon after the order was given for the Chinese consulate in Houston to close down, videos were shown of consulate staff burning what appeared to be documents. And in addition to this, the White House is now warning the CCP against using tit-for-tat retaliation with its closure of the U.S. consulate in Chengdu. And in relation to these recent closures of consulates, a question is now being raised of whether the Chinese Communist Party was using its consulate in Houston to try to steal research on the coronavirus vaccine. This was, of course, one of the vaguely mentioned issues when it came to this closure. And in addition to this, China has made a $1 billion loan to Latin American and Caribbean countries in order for them to access the Chinese Communist Party's new vaccine it's working on. This is according to a statement from the Mexican government. Also, Chinese biotech company Sinovac has begun a phase 3 vaccine test in Brazil. Now, all of this ties with the Chinese Communist Party's One Belt, One Road initiative, where it's trying to push its influence into other countries. And a big question is being raised now with this in these different countries, including in Brazil right now, which is the Chinese Communist Party using locals in these countries as guinea pigs in tests for this vaccine? This is one of the big concerns, for example, in Brazil right now. This was some of the pushback, for example, the CCP received when it was going to be testing the vaccine in parts of Africa. And this is in addition to reports showing the CCP has been skipping steps in the vaccine approval process, meaning that this vaccine may not be safe to really test on people just yet, at least in some cases. And a big question now with Latin America and the Caribbean is this: is the CCP paying off these local governments to let it use the locals in these countries as test subjects? And another important note here, the Chinese Communist Party is giving them a $1 billion loan. That does not mean a $1 billion gift. And when it ties into the bigger issue with the Chinese Communist Party's One Belt, One Road initiative, one of the major issues with that is that the CCP uses it to get countries into debt traps. It makes them take these loans that they cannot pay back. And it has interest rates and different mechanisms in place that help ensure they cannot pay it back. And once they default on these loans, in many cases, the CCP ends up taking over local infrastructure. This is a way for the CCP not only to spread its influence, but to also essentially subjugate different countries using this program. Now, folks, again, we broadcast Monday through Friday, 5 days a week. And also, if you want to go the extra mile and support this channel, we do have a Patreon. You can find the link to it in the description below. And every Sunday, I'll be doing a live Q&A for our Patreon supporters. Also, folks, if you haven't already, please don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps this channel grow. And also, please tell a friend or family member about this channel. It really helps us as well. That said, please take care of yourselves, stay healthy, and stay free.